Is your engine misfiring? Have you got power loss? Maybe you're burning oil? Don't guess. Test the problem. A compression test is one of the most powerful diagnostic tools that we've got in the garage, and it's the foundation of engine mechanical diagnostic procedures. If you've got a gas-powered engine that's acting up, this one test can tell you whether the problem is mechanical or something related to the engine management systems. I've used this test for decades to help track down blown head gaskets, cracked valves, broken pistons, worn piston rings, and misaligned timing components. Today I want to show you exactly how to run a proper compression test, what the numbers mean, what's good, what's bad, and how to spot deeper problems just from the results. Stop using the diagnostic dartboard and learn the right techniques to accurately determine where the problem is. Let's jump right in. All right, before we dive into this test, let's just briefly go over compression, what it is and why we need it. Compression is simply the idea of squeezing the air-fuel mixture within the sealed cylinder in order to raise the temperature and raise the pressure. And this process is needed in a gasoline engine in order to properly ignite the fuel. It makes the mixture a little more volatile and it makes the explosion inside the cylinder more complete. Without it, the car is not going to run properly or it's not going to run at all. So we need good compression. And in addition to that, the higher the compression, the more power we're able to extract out of that explosion. So we have higher cylinder pressures, we have higher compression ratios, we usually get more power out of an engine. If we start to add other ways to increase the volumetric efficiency of the engine, like turbochargers, superchargers, and ram air induction, that also helps us deliver more power with the engine, with the existing cylinder. All right, so compression is not the only thing that we need to make an engine run, but it's one of the three critical things that we need. So we need compression, we need spark delivered at the correct time, and then we need fuel and air mixed in the correct ratio where it's able to be burned efficiently. Without those three things, compression, spark, and fuel, if something's missing, your car is not going to run. As we move through this process a little bit longer, I'm going to talk some more about the compression specifications, what they should be, what it means if you have low compression, how do we diagnose with it, what is the test used for? We'll talk about all these things as we go through the video, but I just want to make sure you had that brief introduction to what compression is. Let's talk about the tools and the preparation for this job, what we need to do in advance. I've got some stuff laid out we're going to use here. It's going to start with a compression tester. We need the full kit. The kit will come with a gauge like this, a quick connect on it, and then we'll need the adapters that go inside the spark plug holes. I can tell you this is a motorcycle and engine repair kit, so it works on both small engines and larger engines like cars. Most cars will have two sizes to use instead of three. Just make sure your kit has the size that you need to fit in your spark plug hole. Match up the threads to your spark plugs. Okay. Want to make sure you've got some tools laid out to take the spark plugs out. This one we've got to remove a cover, so I'm going to take the cover off with this. We'll remove some spark plugs with this. I've also got some tools laid out that you don't necessarily need, but I want to show you how to do this job by yourself. If you have a helper, you can have them sit inside the car, they can hold the throttle open, they can perform a couple of tasks for you while you're doing this test, or if you want to do it by yourself, then you'll probably need a little extra help. We'll talk about that a little as we go through it, but I've got here a remote starter button, and this here just allows me to crank the starter over as long as I like from under the hood here. I've also got a relay bypass, which I like to use even better. This one is even easier to use. I just turn the on switch on, I crank it as long as I want, and then I turn it off. Okay, a couple of little leads to use with my remote starter switch. The remote starter switch is great if you know where to connect it. If you have to connect it somewhere in the starter circuit. Now a lot of people will take it, they'll go right to the starter motor from the battery. That's great. One problem with this, the starter motor is tucked underneath this intake manifold. It's not easy to get to, especially if you got the engine warmed up like we do on this one. I don't want to be sticking my hands in there while it's hot. I'm getting it right at the relay, which is over here under the hood. We're going to show you that. All right, let's talk about the procedures now. I just mentioned here an engine warmed up. We want to make sure the car is warmed up to operating temperature if possible. Let's talk about a couple of examples where it's just not going to be possible for you. One might be you're performing a compression test on an engine that doesn't run. Well, obviously there's no way for you to warm it up. You're going to have to do that compression test anyway. Okay. Just means your test data may not be quite as accurate. We don't have the cylinders up to operating temperature. All the metal components haven't expanded, piston rings and pistons to seal up as well as they might when they're warmed up. Okay, so just keep that in mind if you're doing a compression test on a cold engine. Probably not getting the full value out of it. So we want to make sure that's warmed up if possible. Another example might be where the spark plugs are very difficult to access. We've got to get inside the spark plug holes, obviously, and we can't do that if an intake manifold is covering the spark plugs and it's an hour and a half worth of work for you to get at the spark plugs in the first place. That engine's likely going to be completely cooled off by the time you get in there. Not much you can do about that. So go ahead and perform the test anyway, but keep in mind maybe your pressures won't be ideal. They won't be exactly what they would be on a warmed up engine. Okay. Now that I've mentioned that, we need to make sure that we have a fully charged battery. We're trying to get this engine to crank over at normal cranking speed, usually over a few hundred RPM. And if your engine's cranking slow, it's just not going to give you the correct pressures. You're not going to get the right readings out of your test. So let's make sure your battery's fully charged up, or you've got a battery booster on it, something to give it some extra power to make sure that it's cranking at normal cranking speeds. The next thing we'll have to do is we want to make sure that the throttle plates are jammed open. So we want to have your either foot depressed fully on the pedal, or you can stick some sort of device that's not going to get sucked in the engine inside the throttle plates. Make sure they're held open. However you need to do it, jam a screwdriver, put a pair of vice grips or something on the throttle linkage. Whatever you need to do, you got to get that throttle open. I'm going to use this throttle depressor. I'll just go ahead and put this between the steering wheel and the throttle pedal, and that'll hold the throttle wide open for us while we do the test, or you can use your helper for that. All right, so as we go through, I'll show you a couple ways that I'm going to hook up this remote starter switch to make it nice and easy. You don't have to fuss with the starter motor at all. But let's dig right into this test. Let's take some stuff apart. Let's see if we can get some access to these spark plugs on here. We need to take off all the ignition coils to get access to the spark plugs. So we'll get these all unplugged, and then we can unbolt them. Now it's also important that I mention on here, we need to make sure we disable the ignition system and or the fuel system when we do a compression test. Especially if you're driving an older car and you just pull the spark plug wires off. Those wires have a tendency to arc. You're going to have fuel pumping out of these holes possibly, and you don't want to ignite something under the hood while you're doing this test. So if you've got a car with a distributor, make sure you unplug the ignition coil on it. This way you won't be getting any spark anywhere. The ignition coil should be unplugged. If we're going to be unplugging all these ignition coils anyway, we won't have any spark to this car. We don't have to worry about that. There are a lot of cars too. Once you unplug the coils on it, it'll also disable the fuel injectors. So we don't even have to worry about any fuel pumping either. There's some other options there for you. You can disconnect the EFI relays. You can disconnect the EFI fuse. Any of those things that you need to do in order to disable the ignition system and or the fuel system. Make sure you do that before you perform the test. You want to stay safe. You don't want to have a little explosion and a fireball going on over here while you're trying to perform this test. So I've intentionally selected this car because it's fairly straightforward to do a compression test on here. I didn't see any reason for you to watch me take spark plugs out for 2 hours or anything. We just want to get right to the meat of the test on here. So this is probably about as easy as a compression test is going to get for you. We'll need to pull this off. Harness in the way here. All right. Let's blow out these spark plug holes, make sure we don't have any debris fall in there. Okay. And then we can take out the spark plugs. It's not a bad idea to take a look at the spark plugs once you take them out, see what kind of condition they're in. It's a good opportunity to replace them if they need to be replaced. So interestingly enough, this number 1 spark plug looks a little dirty, whereas the number 2 did not. Let's see what these other ones look like. That one's pretty clean. Let's check this one. And that one's pretty clean. Let me line these up for you and show you what they look like. I don't know if you can get a good view here. Oh, these electrodes. You want me to get a lot better light? So I wanted to show you these spark plugs here and show you that number 1 cylinder spark plug. It looks a little bit dirtier than the rest of them. That might be an indication that we've got some fuel problem, we've got some oil burning going on, something in this engine. So just really important when you're doing spark plugs, you pay attention to the condition of the plugs as you take them out. I wanted to show you over here by the fuse box a couple of options I had for you in order to crank this engine over. Obviously you can get inside the car and just turn the ignition switch to the run position or to the crank position, and that'll get the engine cranking over. Or you can hop on the fuse box here and you can do it at a location that's located under the hood. This fuse box has got some labels on it, and it says here ST for starter relay. So right here is the starter relay. I'm going to show you 2 ways to do this. I've got this cool little tool here. I just want to drop this in place of the relay. It's got an on-off switch on it. And all this is doing is jumping out the high current circuit on this relay. And that's going to allow us to get battery voltage to the starter motor, allow the starter to crank over. So I'll put this in place of the relay on there. These come in different sizes and selections to fit different style relays. So it's kind of important if you're going to use a tool like this that you understand what relay you're trying to replace with it and what you're trying to test with it. So this one here is fairly standard type of relay. We'll go ahead and drop it on here, and then this is all I have to do to crank this engine over. It's going to flip to on. I flip it off and I'm done. So that's even easier than me trying to press the button on this thing, and it's also easier to connect. Now let me show you how to connect this remote starter switch as well. Like I talked about a little bit earlier, the starter motor is difficult to get to on this car. So, you know, a lot of times you want to connect this down to the starter lead and then connect the other end to the battery positive, and then we can just apply battery power directly to the starter through this button. But if your starter's not easy to access, if your engine's hot, it's already been warmed up, you don't want to burn yourself, it's just as good to do it right here at the relay. You can do the same thing that little relay tool I showed you will do, just by putting a couple of jumper wires in the same spot on the circuit. Now, for you guys that don't understand relays, maybe there's usually a diagram on a relay and the terminals that you need to jump out, okay? So just make sure you're doing the high current side on them. We don't want to mess with the control side of the relay at all. That's the low current side. Make sure you understand what you're doing before you jump anything out or do any tools. If you don't have a good grasp on that, maybe you're better off stick with somebody inside the car cranking the key over for you. But let me just show you how this would work. I put a couple of jumper leads in here, and then we can just connect the ends of this remote starter switch to it. And then we're going to do the same thing. The only difference is it's telling me now I've got some power in the circuit. I'm just going to press the button. It's going to bypass the relay and crank the engine over. Okay, so same process, a little bit more difficult maybe because I got to find some terminals that fit inside the relay here, versus this already has the terminals in the correct configuration for this relay and faster and easier to use. All right, we've got our spark plugs out. We've got our relay tool installed in the starter relay. I've got my throttle depressor tool installed on the throttle pedal, or you've got your throttle wedged open. Like we talked about, use some pliers, vice grips, pry bars, whatever you need to do to get that propped open. And then we're going to install this tool. Now, this one has the threads that match our spark plug on here. So we're going to be installing this. It has a rubber O-ring on it. It's going to help seal the cylinder. We'll just drop this right in here on cylinder number 1. Now, for those of you that don't know how to determine cylinder number 1 is always closest to the front of the engine where the belts are. If you've got an inline 4, inline 6, or inline 5, usually the front of the engine is going to be number 1. It's determined by where the belts are. If you have a V-style engine or a horizontally opposed engine, that can be a little bit more difficult to find number 1. Sometimes it's labeled on a fuel injector wire, sometimes it's labeled on a spark plug wire or an ignition coil. But generally speaking, if you have a V-style engine, or even if you have a horizontally opposed engine like a Subaru or a Porsche, one of the cylinders has to be a little bit forward of the other. The connecting rods where they connect onto the crankshaft have to be offset. They can't be exactly in the same spot on most engines. So they'll be offset a little bit. That means that one cylinder will have to be a little bit forward of the other one. If you can see that in the valve covers, that'll tell you number one. If not, I recommend you look up the cylinder identification marks on there. So they'll show you what cylinders are which. So you've got 6 cylinders, it'll show you all 6 of them. So 4 cylinders, pretty easy. Number one, towards the front of the engine where the belts are. We've got our tool installed. We'll take our quick connect on here, and we're going to install that on here. And then I usually like to depress the air release on here just to make sure it's not sticky or something. And then what we're going to do, we're going to go ahead and crank this engine over for 4 or 5 cycles. You'll hear it now with some resistance in here on number one, and the other cylinder's free. You should hear those cycles kind of go by, and that's count those out 4 or 5. That's going to give us enough time to get an accurate compression reading. Now, another thing I like to do, I just like to look at the first puff on here and see if I'm getting to somewhere around 50% of my overall compression. I like to peek at that. Sometimes if you don't get a good bump right off the first one, it doesn't really show accurately, but let's take a look and see what we've got on this one. All right, let's test this first cylinder. Okay, so hopefully you could hear there, that was 5 compression revolutions there. So really it was 10 revolutions of the crankshaft, but 5 compression strokes we went. I like to create a little chart for myself when I'm doing compression tests. This one here is going to be wet and dry. We can check both. I've got cylinder 1, cylinder 2, cylinder 3, cylinder 4. And then I'm also going to record. I told you I want that first puff. I want to see where it's at. And then I wanted to see where the compression ended at. So on cylinder number 1, our first revolution round came up to about 70 PSI, and then we ended up with 160 after our 4th or 5th puff. Okay, this is here will be your fan or the front of the engine. Okay, and that just helps keep your numbers square. We're going to come back through here. We're going to do a wet compression test as well. We'll document the readings. This way we've got everything nice and neat and organized for our results. Let's go for number 2, release the pressure and crank it over. I want to repeat that test at least twice. There we go. I'll go ahead and move over to cylinder number 3. I wanted to let you guys know the specs on this car. I believe it's somewhere around 145 to 217 if I remember correctly. Obviously at anything around 200 PSI I would expect to see on a new engine. And I can tell you quite honestly, guys, I don't think I've ever done a compression test on a brand new engine. I just never had a reason to do that. So I don't know a new one would read exactly 217 or 200 or 180, but usually by the time I'm doing a compression test, the car's got a lot of miles on it, and it's normal for them to really not even get anywhere close to the upper limit. So another thing I should mention on here, if you're trying to diagnose a no start on a car, I can tell you anything less than 90 to 100 PSI, that cylinder is going to have trouble with the car running at all. So it's a really weak compression, and you may get some firing out of it. If you've got 3 cylinders running full compression and 1 at 90, you might still get some fire out of that cylinder and a little contribution out of it, but it's very weak. And if you had all 4 cylinders sitting around there, the car is really not going to run. So you got to be somewhere close to the minimum specification here for this engine to run properly. So let's hit this 3rd cylinder and see where it sits. One more time. So far we've been pretty steady across the board on these cylinders. Let's check number 4. So I thought this would be a good time to talk about why we do a compression test. Obviously we know we need compression, we discussed that already, but there are a few examples where you might want to check your compression. The first one that sticks out to me is if you just want to check an engine's integrity overall. Now, this engine is not performing badly at all, although it's got 115,000 miles on it. We're not having any particular problems. We're not trying to diagnose anything on here. So this is a perfect example of where you might want to perform a compression test just to determine the overall health of an engine. We want to see where, kind of give it a baseline, say, hey, what does everything look like? Maybe you're buying a used car and you want to see, if it's been well maintained, and this is one of the steps you're willing to pay for somewhere or willing to do on your own to really determine the overall health of the internals of the engine. Okay, so Without taking stuff apart, it's really hard to see what's going on the inside. Obviously, you can check the oil, you can look inside the valve cover. That's about as far as you're generally going to get before you buy a car. But a compression test will give you a little bit more information, let you know if you're buying something that looks like it's worn out. Plus, not a bad idea if you had the spark plugs out to get a look at those spark plugs we talked about, and maybe get a borescope down the cylinder, see what everything looks like. But if you've got good compression and the car's running good, usually not something I worry too much about when buying a used car, but never a bad test to do for integrity's sake. Now, another reason you might want to perform a compression test is to diagnose a problem. We've got a slew of problems that could really warrant the use of a compression test. Any kind of a cylinder misfire. If you had one of your cylinders you identified not contributing or at all, or contributing a poor or weak amount through a cylinder balance test, that would give us some indication we should perform a compression test on there to see, is it a fuel problem, is it an air problem, is it a compression problem? You know, what do we have going on in that cylinder? So this is a great test for that. And maybe you have more than one cylinder doing that. Maybe you've got a blown head gasket and we've got two cylinders that are adjacent to each other with low compression. Or while I'm performing a compression test, sometimes I can even pull the radiator cap off of the car. I might pull this off and see if there's anything, bubbles or anything forming inside the radiator from that compression pushing into there. You know, you can do that obviously too with the spark plugs installed, but there's a few different ways you can look at a head gasket. You know, the most obvious way to do it is by symptom. You know, a lot of times a head gasket will blow, it'll be leaking coolant inside the cylinders and burning that coolant. You'll get white smoke out the tailpipe. That's usually a telltale sign that you're consuming coolant somewhere, and the most obvious place for that is usually the head gasket has ruptured in between the cylinder itself and a water jacket, water passage inside the engine, okay? But a lot of times we see them blown between cylinders also, blown head gaskets pushing compression into the other cylinder. So you might be getting low compression on here and hearing some puffs out the other side with all the spark plugs removed. Well, that's a very good indication that you've got a ruptured head gasket. That engine's going to have to come apart. That head gasket will have to be replaced. Okay. Some other things we can talk about. If you have one cylinder that's low, it could be piston ring problem. Could be a cracked piston, a hole in a piston. If you've got no compression on a cylinder, that's usually a good indication that something is broken. Now, there's a possibility it's lower end, there's a possibility it's upper end. This is always like a differentiating factor for us as a technician. If we've got zero compression on a cylinder, we want to know where is that compression leaking? Where is it going? Up or down, right? Down being the lower half of the engine, up being the upper half. It's possible you have a valve that's stuck open, you've got a valve seat that dropped out of the cylinder head that was common on the Fords a long time ago. You've got a bent valve. Any kind of valve train problem will obviously not seal the cylinder up, and you'll have low or no compression. And the same goes for the bottom end. Bad rings, usually low compression. Broken rings, usually no compression. Broken piston, no compression. I had a Subaru not too long ago. Came in, the piston was cracked right down the middle in half, and the cylinder was actually still partially firing. So had low compression, but it wasn't good by any means. So a lot of different ways to use this test to determine what's going on with your car. All right, let's go ahead and run the cylinder number 4. Here we go. Now that we've completed this dry compression test across all 4 of these cylinders, I think we've got a really good idea of the overall health of this engine. You can see we're really right around 165, 170 across the board, all 4 cylinders. Everything is working well. We're well within the specifications here, you know, somewhere in the middle of the range, which is great. Now, if you were on the lower end of the range, you could assume there was more wear going on in these cylinders. If your cylinder pressures were low across the board, let's say they were at 120, well, maybe you got a timing problem. Maybe the timing chain, timing gears, timing belt has jumped a tooth, and you're losing some compression because the valve timing is not correct. All 4 cylinders are consistently low. That might be an indication of that. That would require some tear down or disassembly of the engine a bit in order to inspect those components, see if they're lined up properly, see if your timing chain is stretched, any of those types of things. So as I mentioned early on in this video, this compression test is really the beginning of mechanical diagnosis, right? So sometimes there's more we have to do. The next step we're going to perform on here is going to be a wet compression test. And what that will tell us is if our cylinders are being sealed up properly by the piston rings. If we're able to add some oil to the cylinders, circulate a little, and seal up the rings a little better and get a significant improvement, that usually tells us that we've got some significant wear on the rings. Now, a little bit of bump and compression is normal when you add some oil to the cylinders. We shouldn't have any oil really on top of the cylinders because the top piston rings are the compression rings and the bottom rings are the oil control rings. So it would be normal for us to have some jump in compression readings, but it shouldn't be a lot. Okay, so let's go ahead and put some oil in here and run the test again, all 4 cylinders, and see what we've got. So it doesn't matter how we get oil in these cylinders. I think the biggest trick is not to make a giant mess in here. So I'm just going to take this funnel. It seems to fit right in the spark plug, the hole there, fairly tightly. And then I just want to put a couple of ounces of oil in each cylinder. So I'm going to go ahead and squirt a little in here. All right. That should be good. We'll let that drain down a second. We'll move to the next one. And we're going to do the same thing. Just to give you an indication of how much oil is actually going in there. So that's more than enough oil. I really don't like making a mess. I'm going to cover these up here just for a second. Then I'm going to hit my starter switch. This is going to blow some oil out of these holes a little bit as it circulates through, but I really want it to work that oil around, all around the edges of those pistons and the piston rings. And I don't want this blowing oil up all over the hood and stuff while I do that. So let's go ahead and give it a few cranks. We'll hold this rag in place. We'll let it do its thing. Okay, so you can see from the rag, it's pumping oil out of the cylinders now, right? So we definitely lost some oil in there, but the main thing is to circulate some of that oil down around the piston rings. Let's go ahead and give it another compression test real quick. We'll start in cylinder 1 again. Release pressure. So you can see we've got a pretty decent jump there on compression readings. Went from 170 to 190, right? So I'd say 10% of 190 is 19, right? So 170, so we had about a 10% increase. I think that's fairly normal among older engines like this. You get about a 10% increase, and I think that's fair to have that kind of increase on it. So that one went up to about 210. 210, 220, not so bad. Cylinder number 3, here we go. I'm gonna call that one 225. Cylinder number 4. All right, so there we've wrapped up a wet test and a dry test on all 4 cylinders. Let's talk about these results for a second. So I've written these down for you here, and I want to kind of go through them. We can see on here that our compression readings were even from cylinder to cylinder, whether they were wet or dry. That indicates we don't have one wearing more than the other. We also have indicated that our compression readings, wet and dry, are both within spec. And I would actually say when they were wet, they were at the very high end of the specifications, maybe a little bit over in a couple of instances. But we had a huge discrepancy between the wet readings and the dry readings. Now, normally you don't want to see something like this. You don't want to see it, 40% difference increase in a wet test. That usually indicates you've got some ring problems. Now, we talked a little bit earlier about the first puff and why I write that down. So that first puff should be higher. Like I said, anytime you're doing an older engine, you want to see at least 50%. We were barely hitting the 50%, and that first puff is really giving us a better indication of the sealing power of the piston rings in this cylinder. So we've got a couple of things pointing towards the fact that we've got some piston ring wear, particularly probably we've got some wear going on because our first puff couldn't hit 50%, and whether it was wet or dry, it was barely 50%. I mean, really, ideally, you'd probably like to see that even closer to higher to 70 or 75%. So you want to see that really pop up high on the first shot, and then just kind of topping off the next 3 or 4 puffs. So we weren't getting that. So everything we're seeing in here is giving us some indication we've got some lower engine wear, specifically rings, cylinder walls, something like that is going on. Now, we could follow this up some more if we wanted to, and we could go ahead and do a leak down test. As a matter of fact, we're going to do a leak down test on that. That'll be in our next video. So keep an eye out for it. We'll go ahead and perform a leak down test on here. We'll show you how to determine where the leakage is. Now, we didn't have any indications in this car of any upper end problems, valve train problems whatsoever, head gasket problems, okay? So if we had some other symptoms, we would definitely want to do a leak down test on it to determine that. I think from what we've seen so far, we can determine that we've got lower end engine wear on this. Now, it's not necessarily a problem. The car is running fine, but I would imagine, and I don't know anything about this car, but I would imagine that if we were to run this thing, we might notice or talk to the customer. We might ask them, hey, do you have to add oil from time to time? Maybe we look for blow-by gases in here and see if there's excessive blow-by in the crankcase. You can usually pull the valve cap, or the oil cap off while it's running and see if you got a lot of blow-by of pressure pumping out of that cap, right? So a PCV system will clean up some of that. It'll take some of those gases and reburn them, but sometimes you get excessive pressure in the crankcase from excessive wear on the pistons, piston rings specifically. So all that blow-by gases are pushing past the rings and pressurizing the crankcase. So if we were to dig a little bit deeper in some of the way this car functions, whether it's burning oil, consuming oil, excessive blow-by, those types of things, we'd probably see a little bit of that in this engine. Now, we talked about a little bit some of the spark plugs in the beginning, when that number 1 spark plug seemed to have some excessive buildup on it, right? That could be part of the problem here, is that this engine has got a bit of wear on it. And like I said, it's got 115,000 miles. The car is 23 years old, I believe, so we would expect to see that. But the customer's not complaining. The car runs fine, not having any trouble passing an emissions test or anything like that, so probably nothing to do at this point. But it's good to know what the readings mean and what we're looking at and what we're trying to achieve with these tests. So this would be a great example. If you were looking to buy this car used and it had 115,000 miles, seems very low for the year. But when I look at the compression readings on here, I say to myself, I think I'd take a pass on this car. I don't think it's been well maintained enough. In a car with 115,000 miles, especially a Toyota, I would expect these readings to be much better. I would like you guys to stick around here for the next part of this video, part 2, where we're going to do the leak down test. So if you learned something from this one, you're definitely going to learn something from the leak down test. It is a bit of a different test, and it helps kind of pinpoint specifically where some of the compression loss would be. So a compression test to determine how much we've got, and a leak down test to determine where does it go if we don't have enough. Thanks for watching this video. We've got plenty more content for you guys. Make sure you check out another one of our videos over here. And if you're really enjoying this content, you're learning something from it, please like and subscribe to our channel. It helps us grow. And don't forget to hit that bell for notifications when we release our next video. Every Thursday, we'll come out with a new one. Thanks for watching. We'll see you in the next one.